this is an NSF-funded project, so it needs an external evaluator, and I'm it. I'm from a place called the Center for Children and Technology. And our problem when we started this a long time ago was to figure out what part needs to be externally evaluated. It's a research project. So the part that needed to be externally evaluated was the technology itself, not what students are learning in the class. So we were trying to figure out, now this is before YouTube, we were trying to figure out what the affordances of this technology actually are. And obviously the thing that immediately comes to mind is close viewing. So we had some kind of elaborate logic model of what we could test, and somewhere in here we looked at, what does the actual vital, the environment, rather than the good teaching on the part of June and Herb, et cetera, what does it do? And so we looked at a number of possibilities: close viewing, increased reflection, deeper insight. We're trying to figure out how do we evaluate this. So we did a number of things, including a somewhat elaborate video test, but that really was very difficult to separate out from the content of what they had actually learned about mathematical thinking. So what we ended up trying to do was to figure out what is it about the ability to actually manipulate the video. What is it that we expect them, the students, to learn from this? And so I found this very old technique invented by this guy called Flanagan a long time ago, and this is just a reference, which is a technique where essentially he was asking people when something happened, some critical incident occurred. It could be the breakdown of a piece of machinery, it could be something else. Very often they used it for nursing, other kinds of health-related stuff. He asked people to provide some kind of description of the critical incident and what made it critical. So we thought that perhaps we could use this very simple structured interview technique to figure out what students thought was critical in their use of the technology in their thinking. So the kinds of questions we asked them are, first of all, to just describe the situation where they thought the environment was particularly helpful to them in their thinking. Just describe what was happening, describe the insight or the information that they got from it, describe the specific feature of the vital environment that was helpful, talk about how it might have been different without this particular feature, and then how important they considered the insight that they got from this use of the environment. So we did these critical incident reports with a bunch of people, and then we had the problem of figuring out how to code the results, because that doesn't come with a technique. You've got to figure that out yourself. So what we started out with was this kind of system. First of all, people just looking at the features of the environment itself, administratively, what made it efficient, useful, etc. Next level, describing something about the content. And what we saw was the kind, I'll talk about it in a minute more, but different ways in which they described what they could actually see in the video as a result of having this more ubiquitous access to it. And then at the bottom somewhere, the highest code, something about the process, that they understood something about having this stuff available to them in this way had some effect on their learning process. When we looked at the actual stuff, we, of course, as always, got a lot of in-between things that weren't quite one or the other. So what we have here is where they're really talking about the features, but there's some reference to the content. We gave that a 1.5. And between 2 and 3 is something, there is some kind of major emphasis is on the content, but there is some general mention of that it may have had some effect on their learning process. So that's the coding scheme we came up with, not very rigorous. And just to show you one set of outcomes, I use this tool called Tinkerplots, but what we have here is those things in the green area. They changed. We administered this twice in the course of a semester, early on when they just used vital once or twice, and then later at the end. And the green area is the people who changed upward by our coding scheme. Pink area is the people who changed downward in our coding scheme. And the yellow area is the people who didn't change at all in our coding scheme. And as you can see, the numbers, up there we have people where we only have a pre or only have a post, so we can't really count them. But anyhow, if you see, the numbers are not persuasive, but at the same time it sort of shows that if there's movement at all, it's hopefully in the direction. So there's some little bit of evidence that the coding direction may have some meaning. But we have to do much more of this, and we have to look at it more carefully, because one of the things we found, of course, as always, is that the middle category is too broad. There's too much stuff in there. So we have these different kinds of foci that people had when they were talking about just the content in the middle there. So we have people looking at this video as models of the profession. clinical interviewing, all that kind of stuff. They saw the video as really demonstrating for them how you do that. We saw people talking about the video as if they were virtual kids that they now got to observe firsthand, which meant that they really didn't they didn't focus on the fact that there was a camera between them and the kid. They really thought they were just seeing a slice of life, right? Then we had people using it as a better way to illustrate the kinds of points they were trying to make in the kind of points that they were learning about in their reading. That this was just a sort of a lively example of what, if you just read text, would be harder to get a hold of. We had people who talked about using it as a better way to make the argument in their assignment. In effect, instead of having to describe all of this in words, they could just point to the video and say, here, this is what I mean, right? And then we had some people talk about the quality of the material itself, how good it was, how much they appreciated being able to see kids do this kind of thinking unpacked in the way it was. All of those were people talking about content rather than what having this stuff available to them did for their learning. There were fewer, but you can see they went up a little. 4 to 11, it's no big whoop, but it's something, right? Okay. So we're going to do more of this because the evaluation requires it. But what it led me to think about is when we have to evaluate this kind of technology, it tends to catch up with us and go ahead of us. So this project started before YouTube. When the idea of having video clips available when you wanted to look at them and be able to mess with them seemed like this fabulous technological affordance, and our entire effort to evaluate was focused that way. Nowadays, it's like no big deal. Everybody has video available, right, all the time. So we have to start thinking more about the genres of video data that we're actually using. In this particular instance, if you look at it, if you sort of think about it from raw to cooked video data, raw would be live cams. You could have live cams in any daycare center, any classroom. People are actually threatening to do that, parents, whatever. And you could just have live stuff coming over. You have ethnographic observations, and the first clip we saw of the two boys was more like that. There was very little framing, except for the camera and the mic, which does do some framing. Then we have collections of examples. That would be Herb interviewing kids. Then we have edited illustrations where people actually use video to make a particular point. So they're carefully selected and possibly edited. And finally, we have video pieces, whether art or journalism, which are very carefully massaged and edited to have a particular effect. So the question is how these different genres can be used by students in an evidentiary manner to provide evidence for some kind of thinking. And it seems to me that what we, as teachers, as instructors, need to focus on if we're going to use this kind of material is if you look over everything sort of from collections over to live cams, what you really have to help folks do is really analyze the content of what they're seeing. But if you look in the other direction, from examples to sort of video pieces, you really have to help them analyze the frame that has been put upon the video, the way in which it has been framed and contextualized, because that's really where the analysis has to occur, because you're no longer dealing with raw stuff. So you have to understand how it was cooked. And so my example earlier that we didn't know about the social stuff that had happened between the kids, or that the camera makes one of the kids the protagonist, that's the kind of stuff that we have to increasingly help students notice unless we're only giving them raw video material. And it is unlikely to be the case. So we have to pay more attention to what the nature of the data actually is. And in this case, it is always partly cooked, with very few exceptions. So the way it's cooked becomes important. So what that boils down to is if we really want students to be able to make optimal use of this kind of video data for evidence-based thinking, we have to define for them what genre of video we're talking about, first of all, so they become aware that it's not all the same. We have to provide some kind of frame, focus, and follow-up, and both June and Herb are increasingly doing that as they use this material, and I'm assuming Annis too. And then we have to provide some set of techniques for some kind of systematic analysis either of the raw video data or of the cooked video data, and those would be slightly different techniques for analysis. And finally, if we want to assess it, we do have to look, as we're beginning to do more and more, at the relationship between the genre of video that we're talking about and its evidentiary value. which is different depending on what genre of video you're talking about. So a highly cooked video has a different credibility than a raw video. We have to begin to dig a little bit more deeply into those kinds of, you could call them visual literacy issues. And so in the final evaluation of this project, we're hopefully going to focus in a little bit more on students' understanding of what kind of data they're actually dealing with here. Then we are going to keep focusing on the fabulousness of the technology, which is by now no big deal. Okay? Thank you.